Okay, our next presenter is Kenneth Kidd, who will be giving a presentation on Marjorie Rawlings and Zora Neale Hurston as writers for kids. Kenneth Kidd, my friend, is a professor of English at the University of Florida. Go Gators. He's the author of 3 books, Making American Boys, Freud in Oz, and Theory for Beginners. Kenneth also has co-edited 5 essay collections on a range of topics, including environmentalism, literary prizing, and queer children's literature. His most recent collection is Alt Kid Lit, What Children's Literature Might Be, and it's just out this month. Congratulations. With Elizabeth Marshall, he co-edits the Routledge book series on children's literature and culture. Please welcome Kenneth Kidd.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay so far? So first of all, thank you. It's so fabulous to be here. What a gorgeous film that was, and such a privilege to hear from Donna and Kathleen, and just to be reminded of that rich history and to learn so much more. So thank you for that. It was absolutely beautiful, and all of the presentations have been so great. And I just also want to acknowledge Flo, my colleague, who makes my time at UF especially special. She's been a huge resource, collaborator, friend, and obviously a very excellent scholar herself, and I've learned a lot from her work. So there are so many great points of overlap here. I'm excited about that. You are my people. I'm becoming one of your people. I'm not sure which. Maybe all of the above. You've converted me. So thank you. And it's also wonderful to be in Mount Dora. This really is just a gorgeous place. So I am going to be talking to you today about both Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings and Zora Neale Hurston as writers for kids. And this might seem like a little bit of an odd angle on these two remarkably gifted women, right, who were, of course, forensic contemporaries, as we all know. And since neither of them really identified, right, as writers for kids. Although Rawlings edged closer to that identity later in life, writing a picture book, of course, that was published posthumously, The Secret River, which many of you know. And let's see, I'm not sure if I have this the correct, is it upside down? Yeah, there we go. This, of course, our colleague Flo has written very brilliantly about this book in the 2 major editions that have been published so far. And I realize that the room is really deep, and so you may not be able to see the text. I apologize for that part, but I'm citing Flo's article in the Journal of Florida Literature, which compares the 2 editions. So I would direct your attention to that if you'd like to know more about The Secret River. I'll talk about it a little bit more. Rawlings was, in addition to this, also aware of the possibility that her most famous work, The Yearling, could be misunderstood as a so-called boys' book, and this, of course, came up in the documentary. Exactly because she sort of fashioned the book a little bit sort of in the tradition of the boys' book, right, and was thinking especially of Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. There were a number of titles that were published from about 1865 to 1920 that were sort of boy books. The Story of the Bad Boy is one of the more famous ones. Peck's Bad Boy, there's a lot of them. And of course, the argument was always that Huck Finn sort of transcends this category, right, and sort of is and isn't of the genre, right? So it's kind of a similar argument about The Yearling, but I do think that Rawlings sort of was interested in that association, but also didn't want to be marked from it. And this is where Anne McCutcheon has also talked quite a bit about this topic, and it was a kind of tricky thing to navigate for Rawlings. But in any case, she was aware of the association. I think she sort of hoped to capitalize a little bit on the popularity of boy books, even as she rightly remained, I think, sort of anxious about that association, just as she kind of both invited and sort of worried about the category of regional writer, right? So same kind of complication there as she was really competing with and trying to make her mark in a sort of very male-dominated publishing culture still, right? In any case, as I mentioned, Anne has written about this dimension, and other scholars have commented on it as well. Zora Neale Hurston, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have entertained, as far as I can tell, any notion of herself as a children's writer per se, even though she did produce work in very diverse genres, and was always looking for publishing opportunities, right? She was very open to different kinds of projects. But even more than Rawlings, and this is kind of where my interest comes in, Hurston has been sort of reclaimed after her death as a writer, not just appropriate for kids, but writing material for kids. And I've been thinking about Rawlings and Hurston as part of a book that I'm working on now on Florida children's literature. And of course, it's difficult, if not impossible, to sort of establish clear boundaries around that category, right? Do I mean children's literature about Florida, set in Florida, written by Florida authors, or what? Kind of all of the above, in a sense. And I'm also interested in sort of Florida-based or Florida-preoccupied writers who focus on childhood and maybe court family readerships, right? If neither Rawlings nor Hurston identified as writers for kids, both women were very interested in childhood and youth and experiences of coming of age. Their most famous novels, of course, The Yearling for Rawlings and Their Eyes Were Watching God for Hurston, as very different books, but published just a year apart. Despite the differences, they do share a focus on youth, in a sense, and the kind of complications of growing up, just sort of broadly sort of understood. And they're written out of a commitment, both of them, to Florida rural experience, right? And across their corpus more broadly, Hurston and Rawlings explored the sort of playful spirit and creative intelligence of young people who are less privileged socially, right? So that's one real point of commonality. That interest or commitment makes it, I think, easier for us to think of them as writers for kids in a kind of very expansive sense. So even in their own lifetimes, I think there is a kind of argument to be made. I'll talk a little bit about Rawlings and then a little more about Hurston, and I'll try to keep an eye on the clock too, because I don't want to run into lunch. But as we know, Rawlings started writing while young, and as a girl, she entered a children's writing contest in the Washington Post, winning $2 for a story called The Best Spell, and I'll learn this from Anne's book. As a teenager and college student, she wrote fiction and poetry, as well as journalism. And as we know, again, from Anne's biography, Rawlings had an ongoing interest in boys, specifically, and kept writing about them well before The Yearling. At age 16, she won her second literary prize for The Reincarnation of Miss Hetty, which was published in McCall's magazine, and this was a story about a spinster who adopts an orphan boy after the accidental drowning of her own baby brother. It's worth noting, writes McCutcheon, that Miss Hetty is the first of several stories, including The Yearling, with a vulnerable boy at its center. Not only did Marjorie prefer an audience of boys, she tended to feature them in her work and look after a few in her adult life. And again, that's a citation from Anne's book. Rawlings' husband, Charlie, Chuck, mentioned to her, of course, famously, and most of you know this history, that parts of her first novel, South Moon Under, would appeal to boy readers. And Max Perkins, as we have heard earlier today, again, picked up on this line of encouragement. Marjorie was interested and corresponded with Perkins about her boys' book before it was even being written, and the rest, as we know, is literary history, kind of complicated literary history. In an exchange with Perkins in 1936, which I believe was one of the letters that was quoted in the documentary, she writes that this will only incidentally be a book for boys. Rawlings hoped that the book would kind of invite nostalgic responses in older readers, but she wrote, it is important that no announcement ever be made anywhere that the book is a juvenile. So once again, back to that thing, which I completely understand in this context. Winning the Pulitzer Prize for The Yearling, of course, led to both sales and literary success for Rawlings. The Yearling was taken very seriously and reviewed well, and it was understood precisely as Rawlings intended, with reviewer Roland Soskin likening Jodie Baxter to Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, and, quote, lesser members of the fraternity of young boys in American literature. The book has long been sort of packaged also in the tradition of sort of boy and dog stories, or in this case, boy and deer. It's actually sort of a template for those stories, although there were some that were prior, but many of them since, right, all the way through Old Yeller and so forth, right, with cover designs kind of accentuating that association or that tableau. Marjorie's masterpiece, writes McCutcheon, suffered more from misidentification as a children's book. And the 1946 film, as wonderful as it is, sort of advanced that impression in some ways of that association, carrying The Yearling into the grade school story hour during the 50s and 60s. And this is, again, the discussion that Anne has in her book. And so, you know, the film and the book were associated with sort of children's cultures in ways that were both really good because it maintained the reputation of the book, right, and we heard about that. At the same time, it was the source of some anxiety for Rawlings herself, because she wanted it to be understood as real literature, right? As a consequence, the book was increasingly framed as a children's book, which of course it is not. And I'm putting this up here because Huck Finn too has been packaged and repackaged as a sort of simple boys story, as a film, as a kid's happy-go-lucky film, and this illustration from Disney version kind of gives that impression. And if you read Huck Finn and you know anything about it, this is completely right contrary to the spirit. I mean, the book is about a boy, obviously, but that's about where the resemblances end to this funny picture. But in any case, while The Yearling isn't only a children's book, I don't think that means that it's not a children's book. I think one issue in part here is kind of what we assume counts as children's literature both now and then, so that's something you have to kind of look at. Sometimes I think we forget how rich and complex books for kids have always been, and really neither the content nor the complexity of The Yearling sort of excludes it, I don't think, entirely from the category. I understand the arguments why it isn't technically a children's book, but the first Newbery Medal winner, for example, in 1922, was a massively detailed history of the world called The Story of Mankind, which does not have a child focalizer, as they like to say, or a child subject. And a lot of the early Newbery Medal winning titles were rarely quick or easy reads. They were often pretty demanding stories. Now, granted, they were written mostly with more with child readers in mind than Yearling probably was, so I think that's the distinction. Rawlings, of course, became a children's author more officially only after her death with the publication of The Secret River in 1955. She wrote that text, and Leonard Weisgard eventually provided the pictures, although after Rawlings rejected the suggested illustrations of Bob Camp. And this, again, is a history that Flo talks about in her article. The story of The Secret River, as many of you probably know, this is where I'm preaching to the choir a lot in this paper, is about a smart and imaginative young girl named Calpurnia who finds a secret river and catches secret fish. The story is, I think, vintage Rawlings with key changes in focal character. A young girl lives with her family in the Florida forest, and at times are both happy and hard, just as The Yearling opens with the dreamy, nature-loving Jody enjoying a fine spring day. The Secret River opens with the dreamy, nature-loving Calpurnia listening to birds and enjoying a beautiful day. Also like Jody at the start of The Yearling, Calpurnia is entranced with bees and makes up a little poem about them. So it's a kind of funny detail that the two texts share. She also has an animal companion, in her case her dog, Bucky Horse. At breakfast, however, and also in keeping, I think, with the themes of The Yearling, she learns that kind of lean and hungry times, right, have arrived. Calpurnia's race isn't specified, but Rawlings intended her to be black, according to the conversations that have unfolded, looking at her correspondence and other texts. And in her article, Flo discusses the book's positioning with respect to the racial attitudes of the day, as well as Rawlings' own evolution of that. The Yearling also set the stage for subsequent Florida cracker tales, right, pioneer tales for younger readers, beginning maybe most famously with Lois Linsky's Strawberry Girl, which some of you probably know. Just a few years later, Linsky, 1893 to 1974, was a contemporary of Hurston and Rawlings both, but she outlived them also by many years. Unlike The Yearling, Strawberry Girl was conceived and presented as a book for child readers, and so it's an interesting text to pair with The Yearling in a number of ways. Like The Yearling, it's a literary prize winner. It was awarded the 1946 John Newbery Medal by the American Library Association, and it's actually the oldest children's book prize in the world, and it's probably still one of the more prestigious. It's given to an American title every year. In any case, it also won a pretty high-profile award, and the Newbery Medal institution had been created in the 1920s to kind of help sort of float the reputation of children's literature up and kind of make it a little more middlebrow or maybe highbrow, so kind of put it on the radar as an enterprise for people. Like Rawlings, Linsky drew on personal, if more limited experience among Florida crackers, Strawberry Girl being set near Ocala and focused on two cracker families. Linsky biographer Bobby Malone, and I imagine this is hard to see from the back, but there's a biography called Lois Linsky's Storycatcher by Bobby Malone. Malone suggests that Linsky's interest in cracker culture was first aroused by Rawlings, by the work of Rawlings specifically, and there was some evidence to suggest that. Strawberry Girl is set later than The Yearling in the early 1900s rather than the 1870s, 1880s. And it emphasizes the tension between the traditional cracker pioneer culture and the fast-growing agricultural industry of citrus and strawberries in this case. The success of Strawberry Girl led to Linsky's commitment to a whole series of eventually 17 regional American novels that were written between the 1940s and 1960s. And this was also connected to the Federal Writers Project and the commissioner, of a number of sort of attempts to document regional life across the continental United States. Linsky claims to have pioneered new methods for research and in writing, but those methods look rather inspired by Rawlings. Linsky, for example, interviewed people, listened to their stories, drew especially on child and boy informants, interestingly enough, saying that she got, quote, the most help from boys of 8 or 10 or 12, end quote. Plus, she also wrote in dialect, believing that accurately rendered speech made her books more authentic. So it seems fair to say, I think, that Rawlings was a direct influence, actually, on Linsky, and inspired her as a children's writer, and that The Yearling and the Strawberry Girl together kind of helped sort of boost a kind of market, or at least a small cottage industry of sort of children's titles about cracker and pioneer life in Florida that have continued to be published. Some by Pineapple Press, of course, that supports a lot of the work in the state. And these are just a few of the titles that would be in that tradition that I think is a legacy of Rawlings as well as Linsky. And so a lot of these titles have been published, and in addition to that, Rawlings, of course, helped to inspire some pretty famous children's writers, including the novelist Lois Lowry, who writes that The Yearling, quote, made me understand what fiction could accomplish and what a writer could do with words. So I think that's a beautiful legacy right there. The argument for Hurston is, as a writer for kids, is both stronger and stranger. Like Rawlings, Hurston paid significant attention to childhood in her life in writing. Hurston's two earliest literary publications, the short stories John Redding Goes to Sea and Drenched in Light, both center on the desires and experiences of the young, setting the stage for Hurston's many literary returns to both childhood and to Eatonville, where she, of course, grew up, and which played a really significant role in her work as well as her life. Drenched in Light feels autobiographical with its title character, a young girl named Isis Watts, clearly modeled on Hurston's own childhood self in Eatonville. And then Hurston kind of returns to her feisty childhood self in her memoir, Dust Tracks on the Road, which is an important source for later reworkings of Hurston's biography. And in Dust Tracks, we learn about Hurston as a reader of children's literature. She talks about what children's books she read as a girl. And also as a teller of tales. She muses on her childhood tendency to stretch the truth and tell fanciful tales. And this is again in Dust Tracks on the Road, and this is 1942. And she details her imaginative play with household objects like a bar of soap, a corn chuck, a corn cob, and a doorknob. And she gives them in her kind of childhood lexicon, she gives them names, right? Mr. Sweet Smell, Miss Corn Shuck, and so on. The Reverend Doorknob. While living in Harlem, before she moved back to Florida, Hurston also contributed to a short-lived but significant magazine for young artists and writers. So it's kind of, I would describe it even as sort of a companion to the Brownies book, which was sort of the big groundbreaking sort of first publication for Black kids that was mostly a Harlem Renaissance project. And Hurston had a complicated relationship to the Harlem Renaissance leaders, mostly men, mostly little chauvinist, and basically didn't participate in that, but she was interested in kind of fostering new talent. Hurston's most famous novel, of course, Their Eyes Were Watching God, is not a children's book. I think that's fair to say. But it has become a staple of high school and college literature classes. And I think in that category, and because of that association, it's a strong example of what I would want to call curricular literature. It's sort of thinking about the way some of these titles are incorporated right into school curricula, into maybe in the supplemental reading list, if not necessarily taught per se. So it's clearly significant for a lot of adolescent readers who encounter it, right, usually in school. The book is widely taught in 11th and 12th grades, and it's also aligned with the Common Core State Standards, which is endorsed by 41 U.S. states, as well as the District of Columbia. So love it or hate it, the Common Core is widespread, and this is a text that's actually embedded in it. Their Eyes is an adult novel in sensibility, but it is also a build-in roman, right? Following the protagonist Janie's transition from childhood to adulthood, her search for a meaningful life. If the novel isn't conventionally understood as young adult fiction, right, as we would think of that category now, it is read by more teenagers, I think, than a lot of other YA texts, and I think it's arguably young adult adjacent just by that association. We can also look, of course, to Hurston's anthropology and folklore research for affinities with children's culture and literature. Mules and Men, which begins like her fiction in Eatonville, resembles kind of a road trip narrative in some ways and features a diverse assortment of tales, songs, games, including children's games. She was very interested in children's games. Hurston was, in fact, she wanted to devote a separate volume to that topic and never actually quite produced it, but she did a lot of research on it. Some of the tales she includes in her collections are animal name tales, right, which are stories of sort of the bear rabbit variety, etc. This and her subsequent folktale collections emerged from the trips that she took, right, in the American South and in the Caribbean. And they don't represent all the material she gathered, but it's another dimension of what I would think of as sort of folklore / children's culture. Folklore is not always children's culture, but it has connections there, right? What's really interesting, though, and I promise this is the last main topic I have, is the posthumous claim on Hurston. So long after she passed away, and in light of the rediscovery of Hurston, mostly by feminist and Black writers, beginning in the 70s, she has become increasingly a really important character and author of children's literature by and about Black citizens especially. So the posthumous claim as a writer has taken a couple of stages as far as I can see. First, around the same time that Their Eyes Were Watching God became sort of entrenched in high school and college, children's biographies of Hurston appeared. That was sort of the first wave, and they were picture biographies mostly, and occasionally in illustrated titles for older readers. So some of the titles on the top row here, which you may or may not be able to see there, are biographies, and they include Zora Hurston and the Chinaberry Tree, The Fire, which is a recent graphic novel illustration titled after the magazine that she worked on briefly with Langston Hughes. And then, of course, Jump at the Sun. So these are several that were published beginning in the 80s. So that was sort of the first stage. And then, there were these are all kind of portraits of the artist as a young girl, is the way I think of them. And they emphasize Hurston's gifts with language, her curiosity, and her desire to travel, right? That was a staple for her. So all of that comes up in these biographies. These picture biographies affirm Hurston's status as an important figure while inspiring other African American writers and artists. So she becomes a sort of, muse and mentor for several generations of artists who didn't have personal contact with her, but who find in her work a real source for continuity, especially I think in the South and in Florida, where there were not a lot of publishing opportunities, and so it's a kind of tradition you have to reclaim. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir again, because a lot of you know a lot more about Hurston than I do. A second and overlapping stage of Hurston's kind of makeover as a writer for kids involves picture books adapting various folk tales that she collected and wrote about, and that they're credited to Hurston as a kind of author. So the way these books are situated is that she has assistants from contemporary writers and artists who are sort of channeling her, basically, as it were. So in this, some of the titles here in the second column or the second row are examples of these books that are basically credit Hurston as an author, because they take a tale from one of the collections, illustrate it, maybe make some changes, and so the writer of it is sort of positioning as a kind of midwife or as a kind of collaborator. And these picture books don't just treat folktales as good source material, they amplify, right, the importance of the vernacular tradition and Hurston's importance in spotlighting that. And there's at least 4 or 5 of these books, and you can see some of them here. Joyce Carol Thomas is a prominent writer who's been really involved with working with different illustrators. Christopher Myers, also, who's the son of Walter D. Myers, very high-profile African-American writer, illustrator, has also worked in this tradition. A more recent venture in Hurston translation into children's literature is the Zora and Me middle grade trilogy, which is written by African-American authors Victoria Bond and T.R. Simon. And this is with the permission of the Trust, which was sort of a big deal. And they collaborated on these 3 novels. They co-wrote the first one, and then they alternated writing the second and the third. So they're really good. Bond and Simon collaborated, as I said, on the first volume, Zora and Me, 2010, and then alternated with Simon writing The Cursed Ground and Bond writing The Summoner. So these were 2018 and 2020. And they are told from the perspective of Zora's childhood friend, Carrie Brown. And the trilogy kind of concentrates on Hurston's early life in Eatonville while developing a larger historical context for both Hurston and Eatonville. The authors take inspiration from a wide range of sources, including Dust Tracks on the Road, interweaving Hurston's biography with tales that she collected and reflected on in various documents. So just as Hurston kind of mixed up anthropology, fiction, nonfiction, journalism, they do the same in these books. These are fictionalized. It's a fictionalized kind of biography. It's not really biography. It's more creative biography, I guess. It's not inaccurate as biography, but there's a lot that's imagined. There's a good bit of license taken here. In any case, these don't claim Hurston as an author, so that's one difference between these and the picture books. But they do very much present her as an author in the making. Like the whole focus is that she's a storyteller, and that's going to continue. And so they emphasize her storytelling powers, and they link those powers to kind of Black survival strategies, right? Many commentators have noted how fuzzy are the lines between Hurston's fiction and nonfiction, and so on. And these novels also are fiction, but with biographical truths and some folkloric elements. So the trilogy doesn't just thinly fictionalize Hurston's life. They really do combine all of the genres that she liked to work in. And so I think in some ways they're really faithful to her body of work and to her sense of herself as an author and as a person as well. The first novel is a story of her childhood, and it's also a collection of alligator stories and a defense of creativity, while the second and third volumes offer a kind of broader Black and Caribbean context for Zora's story. So they sort of go into the larger frame and thinking about Florida as part of the Caribbean, right? And sort of thinking about those, just that richer geographical context. The trilogy both softens some of the harder facts of Hurston's life and emphasizes more than Hurston did herself the dangers of racial violence. And that's a really interesting tension because Hurston didn't like to talk about that a lot because she felt like it would be understood as, I'm like complaining that life isn't fair, etc. They're like, no, these books need to convey that lynching was a thing and that there are significant issues. So the work of presenting Hurston for childhood and as a kind of proxy children's author continues into our very current moment, and this is my last example. Ibram X. Kendi is now collaborating with Amistad Press on 6 planned children's books about Hurston, 4 illustrated books for beginning readers, and 2 middle grade novels. An imprint of HarperCollins, Amistad Press, has roots in 2 1967 volumes of collected African-American writings put together by Charles Harris. So the press has a long commitment to sort of recovery and signal boosting of Black sort of writing and life. In recent years, Amistad has been releasing new editions of Hurston's work, as you probably know, and has commissioned Kendi specifically to adapt Hurston's writers for younger readers. He is, you may know his name, he's a history professor. He's also a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient and the author of many, many contemporary notable books, including Anti-Racist Baby, Goodnight Racism, and Stamped from the Beginning. The Stamped from the Beginning book may be the more famous of them. In a 2022 interview, Kendi explains that he first encountered Their Eyes Were Watching God in school and came to admire Hurston over his lifetime as he read more about her. And this is Kendi speaking. I also became a father and started reading children's books to my daughter. Having a daughter, particularly a Black girl, and wanting her to read Zora and Black folklore is what initially propelled me to want to do this. I want to bring Zora's work to children everywhere. So the 2 picture books released so far, Magnolia Flower and The Making of Butterflies, they both credit Hurston as author, so we're kind of back to that tradition. The first adapts a short story published in 1925 and then recollected in another posthumous collection called Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick. The second adapts the same story about butterflies that's in Mules and Men that inspired Julius Lester, who's another fairly high-profile African-American illustrator and author. They talk about the difficult. Kidd talks at length about the challenges in adapting, these materials for kids. He says, when you really adore a writer, as I adore Hurston, it's hard to change a word. But I kept telling myself, this is for the kids. I want to do right by her. So again, the need to make changes, but the need to respect the tradition. The tale, this one, the Magnolia Flower Tale, is an interesting choice, as its protagonists are actually a river and a brook, even if the story kind of revolves around a forbidden love affair. And in the author's note on this one, Candy writes that our children should not have to wait until they come of age to read to be shown Hurston's stories. So the idea is, you want them to encounter her as a writer, not just as a historical person earlier, right? As a girl dad, this again is Candy speaking, I did not want my daughter or any child to wait. His ambitions for this book and for really the broader project kind of align with the hashtag We Need Diverse Books campaign. He writes, I'm hoping that Afro-Indigenous children will see themselves, that Indigenous children will see themselves, because Magnolia Flower has an Indigenous theme also, and that Black children will see themselves, and non-Black and non-Indigenous children will see themselves, and will see all of those child subjects. So Candy continues the Hurston Recovery Project with his child reader-friendly version of Hurston's posthumously published Barracoon, which is the first account of the life of Cudjoe Lewis, who was the last human cargo of the Middle Passage. So although slavery in the U.S. ended with the Civil War, since 1808, it had been illegal to import enslaved people from Africa to the U.S. That was kind of the first stage, right, of ending slavery as an institution, or at least as a legal institution. And Lewis was captured and illegally smuggled into the U.S. as a young man. He was still living when Hurston met him and interviewed him in 1927, 1928. So Hurston's account of this was published finally in 2018. So it's a fairly recent publication, 8 decades right after she put it together. And Candy's adaptation was just released in 2024. Some of you may have heard Candy talk about this book if you were in Gainesville in January. He gave he launched the project actually at Lincoln Middle School in Gainesville last January, where he was in conversation with Hurston scholar Deborah Plant. And when Deborah asked him, why adopt this work for kids? Because this is a hard story, right? Why this one? He says, well, he remarked on the current resurgence of racism in Florida, including the whitewashing of Black history, and especially denialism around slavery and its ongoing brutalities. You may remember that in 2023, our governor and the Republican-dominated legislature directed the Florida Board of Education to approve new standards for the teaching of African American history in schools. One requirement is that middle school teachers explain, quote, how slaves developed skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. What the language says, in other words, teachers must explain that slavery helped slaves, providing a practical education and transferable skills. I mean, that's really the argument. This, unfortunately, is the backdrop and the motivation for not only the general conversations we're having these days, but for Candy's signal boosting of Hurston. Candy also points out that the original slavers were really kind of also book banners, like banning not only books, but literacy itself, right? So the tradition of censorship has a long history. Okay, so to sum up, whereas for Rawlings, the association with children's literature was sort of a mixed bag, for Hurston's reputation, it's been pretty positive, part of a progressive rediscovery, right, or a reevaluation of her work. I don't think Hurston could have anticipated any of this literary afterlife. Well, I suspect that she would have enjoyed it. I suspect she would have enjoyed it and would probably have energetically embraced the identity of children's writer if it meant good sales and respectable status. Or if it just meant good sales, that might have been enough. Financial security, pretty important. So Hurston didn't choose not to write children's books, rather she produced what interested her and where she could find a market, right? So we can't assume that she had the same options, I think, as white writers. including the choice to go juvenile or not go juvenile. That just wasn't on her, menu. Hurston's situation as an African-American writer was obviously complicated and precarious, and she just never quite enjoyed the financial stability that Rawlings did enjoy after the Yearling, and any treatment of these two writers together have to obviously account for very different social realities. And I'm indebted to Anna's work on their friendship, and so good. So all these years later, we find ourselves in an interesting place, I think, where Rawlings is not as known beyond Florida, right? And that's something we've been talking about. In contrast to Hurston's massively elevated profile in literary and popular culture, right, which is sort of enhanced by her makeover as as the sort of children's writer. And of course, there's the Fest, which we know about, the Zora Fest, and this is actually a couple of years ago, still from it, but I really liked it. There was also a conference that focused on Afrofuturism. And then, of course, references to Zora in popular culture, which I think we just don't see as much now with Rawlings. And I think, again, a lot of this is to try to repair and make up for the fact that for decades and decades and decades, there was so little representation that most of the books that were about Black kids or Black subjects in Florida were published by white authors, almost all of them, and until at least the 1960s. And the slide that I kind of glossed over was, you do have Langston Hughes and Audrey Bontemps working in earlier period, setting work in the South, but not Florida necessarily. Bontemps was really more Alabama sort of focused, I think, and Mississippi. But they did collaborate, so there was some effort. But in terms of publishing, of course, there was very little happening in the state. So in any case, treating, I think, Hurston as an author as well as a subject of children's literature makes better sense in light of that broader history. And the reconstruction of Hurston as a Black writer for kids, I think, helps correct a sort of publishing gap, or at least helps make reparation to some extent for it, as well as address our own, challenge and political and cultural moment. So, and treating both of these gifted women as writers for kids, I think, brings out some interesting dimensions and tensions of their work in life that we might otherwise miss or undervalue. So, thank you. Appreciate it.